Hey everybody, it's LavenderTowne, and I hope you're somewhere cozy and safe because today I'm doing a reading and illustration of My Family Experienced a Deadly Car Crash, a Creepypasta by Icy Dice. I hope you enjoy. 8:40 on a Saturday evening. They say that there were some moments in our lives that we'll remember for an eternity, events that we find are branded into our minds whether we like it or not. We say that we recall these moments down to the minutest detail, and I can attest to that theory quite well. The clear water droplets plummeted from above, splashing onto the windshield. Cars traveled alongside the vehicle, their headlights illuminating the rain, and the night sky contained thousands of dazzling stars above. Inhale. My chest rose, my lungs taking in crisp air from the slightly open window beside me. I turned my head, my eyes meeting with hers, and then falling about her gorgeous teeth and her rose lips. Exhale. My gaze fixated on my rearview mirror, observing my young boy strapped firmly in the back seat, fast asleep. Inhale. My eyes grew wide as the high beams flooded my vision. In an instant, I launched my foot towards the brake, clenching my teeth, jaw locked firmly shut. The sound of metal sliding terrorized my ears, and my car's momentum carried us forward. Glass shattered as the vehicle came to a violent halt, causing my body to jerk forward and my face to plant directly into the steering wheel. Two shrieks, one from beside me and one from behind, erupted into the night. They died down as soon as they began, and suddenly there was no sound at all. My body was rendered immobile, and my eyesight faded away, yet my lips still functioned. They gently parted, but all I could squeak out was a measly, "No," before darkness overwhelmed me. From that point on, I vaguely recall the noisy sound of bustling people and being in a white corridor. Beaming lights shone overhead, beckoning for me. I tried reaching out towards it, yet I could not move my arms. My eyes fluttered, and I once more drifted away into sleep. I would stay in the hospital for several weeks, recovering from various fractures and undergoing multiple surgeries. My body ached, yet my physical pain could not compare to the worries that I had about my family. Although I felt a relief like no other wash over me when the staff informed me that my son had survived, a familiar sense of dread later overtook me as I learned my wife was in critical condition. Those nights took an eternity to pass. I consistently glanced towards the clock on the wall, observing the hands tick by, minute by minute. Tears would claw their way from my eyes at strange hours of the day, drenching my face in moisture until my cheeks burned red. The sweat forming in my palms dampened the bed sheets I clenched. Each time one of the staff or doctors came into my room, my vision darted towards them. I knew they could read my mind. They would give me this pitiful look when they looked at my pleading eyes. Every time I asked, they would give me the same non-answer. "I assure you, Mr. Johnson, we are doing our best to treat your wife." Every day I met with some variation of this response, yet I persisted, determined to hear that my wife would be okay. Until one day, one of the staff entered my room. Shakily standing up to greet him, I grinned and extended my arm towards his. That's when I noticed the sullen look plastered on his face, and my heart descended below my chest. He spoke calmly, methodically, each word exiting his lips in slow motion. My knees quivered lightly at first, then more rapidly as he continued. As they eventually buckled, I collapsed to the floor, my chest furiously heaving, each breath I took growing more exasperated than the last. Several people restrained me and placed me back onto my bed. I think they were trying to give me words of encouragement and sympathy in the process, but whatever they said blended into an incoherent mess. The men and women beside me blurred into unrecognizable forms, and they stared straight ahead. My mind, blank as paper, grew weary, and I finally gave in to the staff attempting to keep me still. The nurses helped clean me up shortly after the outburst. After receiving fresh clothing and being given time and space to come to terms with the news, my nurse took me to the lobby. All I wanted at this point was to see my son. There he stood, waiting for me. I rushed towards him as quickly as possible. Stooping down, I embraced him, resting my chin on his scalp and gently patting his back. He buried his head into my chest. I could feel that he was crying, and I held him even closer. He knew. Before we left the hospital, I received a few recommendations for psychiatrists and therapists in the area. After thanking the staff for all their help, my son and I took the bus back to our neighborhood later that night. We had baked chicken with rice, but he just sat there, poking his food with his fork. Sighing, I finished my plate, hoping it would inspire him to do the same. Instead, he pushed his dish away from him, in front of where an empty chair stood before the table. I knew he wouldn't budge, but I was aware that the hospital had been keeping him healthy and nourished. I told him that he should go to bed and get some rest, and he obliged, hopping up from his seat and making his way to his room. After he crawled in bed, I tucked him in and asked him if he'd like me to sleep in his room for the night. He shook his head, rejecting my offer. I bent down and kissed his forehead, wishing him a good night. I opened my laptop and researched the therapy centers cited in the pamphlet I received earlier. I grimaced when I read the cost for each one. My wife made money along with me for our family. That, combined with the opportunity cost forfeited by my hospital stay, took immediate therapy out of the question. Sighing, I closed the computer and trod over to my bedroom. Placing my palm against the wooden door, I traced my fingers along its perimeter until they met the cold brass knob. Counting down from 5, I forced myself to open the door upon reaching 0. I set foot into the room, flicking the light switch upward. As the bulb cast its light onto the dull gray walls surrounding me, I mustered the courage to set one foot in front of the other. Making my way over to the oak frame of my queen-size bed, I looked upon the blankets before me. The bed felt so different. It felt so empty. Beside the bed sat a dresser, with a picture frame placed atop it. There stood a man and his soulmate, their faces beaming. Feeling the tears trickling down my cheeks, I glanced back towards the bed, realizing I was dampening the sheets while I wept. Breathing in deeply, I turned and exited the room with haste. Retreating to the living room, I laid down on the couch, and after a few hours of tossing and turning, my body finally shut down and let me rest. I didn't recognize where I was. All I knew was that pure light surrounded me, overloading my senses. My mouth opened, yet I didn't make a sound. I extended my arm, groping ahead of me for whatever surface I could find. My fingers were met with a wheel. The sound of an engine roared from somewhere within the light. Tires swerved and voices shrieked. Metal tearing into metal, incoherent, shrill cries produced from the back of the car. Was this truly happening again? My head jerked forward with the momentum of the vehicle. The commotion ceased as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving me in a state of disarray. The cold night air seeped in through the shattered window, erecting the hairs on my arms. Everything was still. It was a dream. I knew it was a dream. So why could I so vividly sense the beads of sweat trickling down my arms and pooling around my knuckles? How is it that a figment of my subconscious mind was able to perfectly replicate the texture of the leather-coated steering wheel which I so desperately clung to? Internally, I knew what would greet me if I were to shift my gaze to the right. Then I felt it. The round object slumped against my shoulder, the messy strands of hair against my arm. The warm, liquid droplets falling and splashing against my hand. I couldn't even form a coherent thought before my attention shifted to the sudden weight pressed against my shoulder. 5 slender fingers held me in their grip. My head spun around in the opposite direction to observe who was touching me. Upon doing so, my gaze was met with an arm reaching through the shattered window. I tilted my head up, and before me stood a man. He stood tall, adorned with black jeans and a gray dress suit. His frame was much too small for his clothes. He appeared fragile. The skin of his arms seemed to loosely stretch over the bone underneath. It was as if he would disintegrate if even the slightest force was applied to him. Despite the situation around me, my body eased into the seat. I felt a sensation of relief wash over me. He carried an inexplainable aura of familiarity about him. Even despite his malnourished frame, even despite his lanky stature, even despite his face appearing to have been blurred out of existence entirely, I did not fear him. It almost depressed me that my encounter with him was brief, as I awoke before my eyes scanned what should have been his face. It all happened so fast. I placed my hand on my left shoulder, running my fingertips along its surface. The imprint that would have been left by the man was not there. Of course it wasn't. It was just a nightmare after all. I can't say for certain I understand what I dreamt of that night. It all felt so real. I didn't recognize the man I encountered either, so how could I possibly have felt such an intrinsic connection between him and I? Although I'm not sure what to make of it, I can't help but get the sneaking suspicion that there's more to this than I'm currently comprehending. After all, a dream is said to be a gateway into the subconscious. An update. I felt a soft tugging on my beige shirt. The small hand of my boy gripped the polyester tightly. I placed my hand on his head, gently massaging his scalp and pulling him closer to me. The funeral service had just occurred hours prior. Our family wasn't particularly social. We had a few friends and family stop by and offer their condolences to me. It was nice, but if I'm honest, it didn't make me feel better in the slightest. Excuse me for feeling this way, but I wasn't exactly receptive to socializing at my wife's funeral. I only went out of necessity, as well as in pursuit of some form of closure. That closure never did arrive. After it was all said and done, the other attendees left, and it was just my son and I standing before her casket, all alone. I stepped forward and placed my hand on the wooden box. The casket sat on a platform. Roses and candles were placed near it on a table. It was a lovely setup, yet it didn't feel complete. I knew her body wasn't inside. Her mangled corpse could not be presented for an open casket funeral, so we planned on having her cremated and having her remains buried. I turned, preparing to leave, but before I could, something peculiar caught my attention. I spun around, eyeing the casket. Had I been hearing things? No, the only ones in the room were my son and I. I turned back to exit the room, only to find my boy had disappeared. Where had he gone? He couldn't have left the room. I hadn't heard any footsteps. Before I could call his name, I heard it again. I most definitely had not been imagining things. "Sean, where are you, buddy?" I called out, now aware of the anxiety bubbling within me. I heard no answer. Rather, the only thing I heard was a faint laugh coming from behind me near the casket. I recognized that laugh. My breath got caught in my throat and I spun around, facing the source of the noise. There she stood, her angelic presence seemingly illuminating the room. "What the?" I uttered, staring ahead in disbelief. It was impossible. "I have to be hallucinating," I muttered. Had I gone insane? I had been so wrapped up in my thoughts I had immediately noticed myself moving towards her. I extended my arms, resting them on her shoulders. Her red freckles adorned her face, having just enough opacity to be noticeable. She smiled, whereupon her dimples appeared. It was her. She was standing before me in the flesh. I wanted so desperately to speak, but I could only choke on my own words. She delicately placed her hand on me, the cold, smooth surface of her ring grazing my cheek. Lowering my arms to her waist, I held her against me. When gazing into her eyes, the rest of the world simply ceased to be. All that existed was her and I at that place at that time. Gently we swayed back and forth like the leaves of a tree on a gusty autumn day. Rocking forward and backwards, we held each other in our arms. Her skin was warm and I became entrapped in her aura. My muscles relaxed and soon enough I was no longer conscious of our movements. My body went on autopilot as we danced to the beat of our hearts, conjoined as one. I was in heaven, for she was alive again. I closed my eyes, smiling. I heard a wet splash. At the same time, liquid pooled onto my hand. Its warmth juxtaposed the suddenly cold surface I felt pressed against me. My eyes sprung open. The once lively eyes of Elizabeth were now sunken and dull. Her appearance was now ghoulish, and her skin appeared to stick closely to her bones. Looking down at my hands, I saw that they had been covered in blood. A large laceration covered the surface of her stomach, and the stench of charred flesh infiltrated my nostrils. I shoved her away from me and collapsed to the floor. I only had a split second to process what had happened before vomit erupted from my mouth. I wish I had not met her gaze again. Her sweet smile had transformed into a sickening grin. She dragged herself towards me, leaving a streak of blood in her path. I attempted to get up and stumble away from her, but to no avail. I felt nauseous and struggled to do anything besides clumsily shuffling away. I grimaced in pain as I felt her latch onto my arm, digging her yellowish, rotten nails into my skin. She used her momentum to lunge at me, shoving me to the ground and landing on top of me. I screamed and fought, and I clawed at her, desperate to get her off of me. Somehow, even though her body appeared rotten and broken, she overpowered me, scraping and clawing at my flesh. Then, I felt a tug on my beige shirt. A tiny hand gripped the polyester fabric. I picked myself up off the floor and looked down at my son. He looked back up at me, a look of fear and concern on his face. A puddle of vomit and tears occupied the floor beside where I had collapsed. Did I imagine everything? No, I quickly realized that that wasn't the most important question at the time. Had my boy just witnessed what had happened? How could I have allowed myself to appear so weak in front of him? A boy is meant to see his father as a superhero, a strong man who can persevere through anything. Not only had that person collapsed in the hospital, but had collapsed here as well. What would he think of me? Regret and dismay ran through my veins at that moment, but those feelings were interrupted as Sean embraced me with as much strength as his little arms could muster. I froze and then gently reciprocated his embrace. He had seen me collapse, crying, seen me at my most vulnerable. Yet when I looked upon my son, comforting me when I needed it most, I didn't see a child who felt disappointed in his father. All I saw was an act of compassion. Not wanting to cry more than I already had, I let go of Sean and stood upright. He was only a child, and he had already suffered the loss of his mother. At such a young age, I doubted he had much understanding of the concept of death at all, but I knew for certain he missed Elizabeth, and so I knew I had to be there for him. I promised then and there that I would be strong for Sean. We arrived home that evening. I treated Sean to the best pot roast I could make and was ecstatic to see that he had finally regained his appetite. I tucked him into bed soon after. I brought a chair by his bed, pulling his sheets and covers over him. The lamp by his bedside shone brightly. "You doing okay, little guy?" I inquired. He didn't want to respond, of course. He hadn't uttered so much as a word since the incident. I didn't understand why, but I didn't want to press him on it either. I would get him some help as soon as I could. I grabbed his stuffed teddy bear from a nearby shelf and waved it in front of him. "You remember how we got this? How we went to the fair last year and you played the baseball game and won Teddy?" I had hoped bringing up this memory would elicit a response from Sean, but he simply smiled and continued to look at me. Sighing, I returned his smile and patted his head. "You know," I said, "when Mommy and I got married, we knew we wanted a baby. Every night we would pray to the angels that a baby boy would come, and one day you came to us. It was the happiest day of our lives, Sean, and from that point onward, you made us the happiest parents around. Mom, she's not around anymore, but I promise that she's watching over you with the angels, and she's smiling, Sean. She's so proud of her beautiful baby boy, and so am I. We will always love you." Again, Sean's lips never parted once, yet I knew he understood. He had to understand. He just had to. I just wanted to hear his voice again. "Good night, Sean," I said, getting up to leave his room. Before I could, he reached out and grabbed my arm. "Oh, right. Sorry, buddy," I said, leaning over and kissing his forehead. He nodded his head in satisfaction and laid down. I turned off his lamp and closed his bedroom door. Making my way to the bathroom, I went inside and stared into the mirror. I'd kept my promise to myself to stay strong for Sean, at least for tonight. I gripped the sink tightly, leaning over and peering into my reflection. What the hell had happened earlier? Could it have been related to the dream I was having the other night? Why was I experiencing these disturbing visions? Maybe I really did need therapy. I had never really had to deal with trauma in the past, so I was unfamiliar with how to process this information. If people knew about the experiences I was having, would they think I was crazy? Was this normal? For the first time in my life, I felt small and out of control. I balled my hand into a fist. That night was a sleepless one. All I could do was look up at the ceiling. Empty thoughts occupied my mind. I couldn't make sense of what I had experienced, so I merely dismissed them as nightmares. I found it hard to eat recently. Besides the pork roast I had had with Sean, I hadn't had much of an appetite for anything. I've lost quite a bit of weight. I haven't been sleeping well either. Despite this, I've been giving my best efforts to stay strong. I truly believe Sean and I will get through this. When Sean fell asleep during the evening, I decided for the first time in a while to try driving again. I had been walking or using public transport to get from place to place, but I knew that I couldn't avoid driving forever. We had taken Liz's car that night, so I was able to use mine. I went out to the driveway and entered my vehicle. I put the keys into the ignition, slowly turning it so that I could hear the hum of the engine. Taking a deep breath, I shifted the gear into reverse and backed out of the driveway. Deciding I would get off to a slow start, I drove through my neighborhood streets at a low speed. The car methodically made its way down the road, and I eased up a little. I was getting comfortable driving again. Mustering up a little more courage, I turned onto a public road so I could practice driving amongst other vehicles again. My hands started to tremble, so I gripped the wheel tightly. I turned on my hazard lights. I needed to pace myself and keep my cool. I applied a little more pressure to the accelerator. My body stiffened as the car picked up speed, and I responded by slowing my breathing. Doing so allowed me to loosen my body, and I pressed down on the accelerator even harder. I lowered the windows and felt the wind blow against my face. Horns beeped all around me. The noise of chattering pedestrians and restaurant music was omnipresent. I remembered the feeling of driving down the road at night in my car, the way the breeze flowed through my hair, the way the paved roads felt underneath my tire. As I looked in my rearview mirror, I almost thought my eyes were betraying me. I was smiling. Not just a smirk, but a full-on grin. I released my grip on the wheel and simply drove. For miles I traveled, not having a care in the world. Oh, how I missed cruising along towards the horizon. That liberating feeling coated me in pure bliss. As darkness enveloped the environment, I flicked on my headlights. Peering into the night sky, I saw the millions of stars sparkling above. Momentarily pausing to appreciate the serene view, my attention was drawn to an alternative source of light ahead of me. The headlights of another vehicle rapidly approached. I defaulted back to clutching the wheel. Those lights, they flooded my vision just as memories flooded my mind. Remembering to be calm, I took another deep breath. For a moment, the light covered my entire vehicle. In a split second, it was over. I observed my rearview mirror once more, watching the car travel down the road behind me. Pulling onto the shoulder, I put the car into park and leaned back into the seat. I let out an audible sigh of relief, followed by a single sentence. I did it. Returning home later that night, I quietly entered my house and went to check on Sean. His door opened with a slight creak, and I made my way over to his bedside. I turned on his lamp, only to find the covers of an empty bed pulled to the side. Confused, I exited his room and called out his name. There was no response. The door had been locked when I arrived, so I knew he had to be in the house. I checked the kitchen and the dining room before making my way to the hallway. The walls were coated in darkness as black as tar, except for the very end of the hall. There stood the door to my bedroom, the glow of light outlining its perimeter. I approached it, placing my hand on the doorknob and entering the room. There sat my son on my bed. In his arms sat a picture frame that held the image of Elizabeth standing by Sean. He stared at the image, his face still as stone. I went over to him, sitting by his side and placing my arm over his shoulder. I noticed dark splotches on the picture frame. Placing my hands under Sean's chin, I lifted his head to face me. Red circles surrounded his watery eyes. Using my thumb to wipe the remaining tears from his cheek, I tried to offer him the best smile I could, but his frown remained. There I sat at a loss for words, my gaze lowered and focused on the picture in the frame. Placing my hand on his, we sat in silence and viewed the photo together. Eventually, I broke the silence, realizing how late it was. Hey buddy, let's head to bed, okay? Sean gave me a slight head nod and arose, traversing the corridors of the house to his room. I tucked him in, as per usual, before retreating to my bed. I picked up the picture frame and held it in my hand. Elizabeth was as beautiful as ever, and for the first time in ages, viewing her did not cause me distress or pain. Rather, I felt a sense of acceptance. I recalled what I told Sean about her watching over him with the rest of the angels. Though I had said it to ease his mind, I too began to tell myself the same thing, that somewhere out in the universe, my Elizabeth was watching, hoping for the best for me. I glanced at the image of Sean standing by his mother. He had the purest grin on his face, one that could melt my heart 1,000 times over. I knew he did because I remembered taking that photo. Yet, that was not how he appeared now. In his place stood a different Sean. A Sean without the grin, without the energetic and hopeful eyes. Rather, one with deep gashes and bruises embedded in his flesh. One whose limbs appeared contorted into unnatural positions. In the blink of an eye, his happy demeanor changed into one of shock and terror. Taken aback, I dropped the photo and rushed back to Sean's room. I burst through the door, only to find him peacefully asleep in his bed. There he was, alive, in one piece. I saw him with my own 2 eyes. Making my way back to the bedroom, I scooped up the picture frame and gazed upon it once more. There he stood, looking perfectly happy. I rubbed my eyes in hopes to clear my vision. I viewed the image again, hoping to confirm that what I saw was real. The photo remained unchanged, still showing Sean as the gleeful little boy I knew him to be. I put the photo away and climbed into bed, pulling the covers over my body. Sinking my head into my pillow, I closed my eyes. Although it took a few hours, I finally drifted into a deep slumber. The following day, I woke up early. Entering the kitchen for a glass of water, the sound of footsteps caught my attention. They were heading down the hallway, which leads to Sean's room. Figuring Sean had woken up, I followed them down the hallway where his bedroom door stood ajar. Inside, I found my boy sitting beside the being from my dream all those nights ago. There he was in his slick gray suit. He appeared malnourished as ever, his thin frame giving him a feeble look. His face remained blurred, so much that I could not discern any of his features. I watched as he extended his bony fingers towards my son, laying them atop his head. He brushed Sean's hair with his hand. Neither one of them faced me, and despite the circumstances, I did not feel fear for my safety or Sean's. I walked towards the creature, attempting to touch it. Mere centimeters before the tips of my fingers grazed its figure, my body lunged forward, my forehead drenched in sweat. I observed my surroundings. I was still in bed, just staring at the photo. I decided to put the picture frame away in my closet for the time being. That thing freaks me out, and after the dream and my hallucination yesterday, I can't bear to view it. Sean, I need you to speak to me. I must have uttered several variations of that phrase for at least half an hour. Please, buddy, you can talk to me, okay? I promise you can talk to Papa. No matter how many times I repeated these words to him, he simply wouldn't answer. I desperately needed to know that he could speak. I needed to know that he was real. The truth is, the constant barrage of delusions had taken a toll on my psyche. Distinguishing between what was real and what was merely a figment of my imagination has become difficult. I had to know if Sean was real. I wanted to believe he was, and I would know he was real if only he would speak. Could he not see the anguish in my eyes? Why couldn't he utter a single word? I gripped his shoulders tightly, begging him to even part his lips once. He never obliged my wish. No amount of bribery or pleading could elicit a response from him. All he did was grab my arm, turn towards his room, and march towards it. As I followed him, an overbearing sense of dread began to brew within me. I felt my heart intensely pounding in my throat as we entered the room together. There the entity sat. My head hung low as Sean released me from his grasp and trekked towards the being ahead. I too approached it, once again attempting to touch it, preparing to suddenly awake from what I had assumed was another nightmare. I placed my hand on the figure, only I didn't wake in my bedroom again. Instead, it too placed its hand on me. Slowly but surely, the details of the being's face were revealed to me. As I looked upon it, I recognized its features. It was like looking in a mirror. It was my face. I stumbled backwards, watching as the thing with my appearance leaned towards my son, gently kissing his forehead. I could only stare in horror. The creature locked eyes with me, and I locked eyes with it. As the situation occurred, a sense of familiarity washed over me. My mind darted back and forth, unsure of what to make of the situation. That is until my thoughts inexplicably settled on the memory of the accident on that fateful night. I recalled the blinding lights, the shrill cries of fear and suffering. No, there was more. The overhead traffic light, from which a soft red hue shone in the night sky. My vehicle had passed underneath the light, and that's when the impact happened. The doctors. Had they actually told me my son had survived? They say that there are some moments in our life that we'll remember for eternity. It was a quote that I wrote back towards the beginning of this text. So then why couldn't I recall the words of the doctor who had told me Sean was alive? Could I truly have forgotten? I snapped back to reality, keeping eye contact with the being before me. Only now Sean was nowhere to be found. The sense of familiarity I felt soon dissipated and was replaced with boiling hatred. I glared at the monster, my palms balling up. I rushed towards it, tackling it to the ground. Before it could react, I began pummeling it with my fists. "You're the reason Elizabeth is gone. You're the reason Sean is gone. I'm going to kill you," I exclaimed, gritting my teeth and continuing my assault on the being. It showed no resistance. It simply allowed me to keep striking it again and again, and again and again and again. I had no plans on stopping. Blood flowed from the thing's face and onto my fists. With every strike, I could feel my body breaking. With every blow, I could sense the light within me beginning to extinguish. Yet I carried on, ignoring the growing pain within me. I was going to kill this man for taking what I held dearest to me. At that point, I couldn't even see the thing. Tears had clouded my eyes, blurring my sight. I simply pounded my fist downwards, hoping to murder the figure in my fit of rage. I felt a soft tugging on my beige shirt. It was gentle, yet enough to polish my assault. A tiny hand gripped the polyester fabric. My arms fell to my side, and I turned my head. There he was. My boy stood by my side. I froze, my eyes widening like saucers as I witnessed his lips parting for the very first time. "I forgive you, Papa." He smiled at me and embraced me once more. I embraced him too, feeling the stream of tears beginning to erupt from my eyes. I soon found that a second pair of arms had wrapped around me, the smooth surface of a ring pressed against my skin. I didn't let go for what felt like hours, but I knew I couldn't hold on forever. As I opened my eyes, I found myself alone, with the figure in what was once Sean's room. I stood up and approached him once more. In one swift motion, I hugged the thing, pulling it close to me. When I let go, it vanished. It was over. I fetched a picture frame from my closet and placed it on my bedside. There stood Sean and Elizabeth, standing beside each other with grins on their faces. In the reflection of the frame, I could see my face beside theirs. I smiled with them one last time, knowing that Elizabeth, the angels, and Sean are watching over me. I hope you guys enjoyed my reading and illustration of My Family Experienced a Deadly Car Crash, a Creepypasta by Icy Dice. Stay safe out there, guys. Thank you so much to my wonderful patrons, including Forrest Spookable, Michaela, Random Thoughts, Vegish, Tom the Chicken, it's Jamal, Kayla Grimes, Rodrigo, Neurocherry, Kelly Halsey, Kubo, Moomilk, Lonnie the Artist, Rylan Parker, Raylan, Kadaria, Something Super, Deadly Nightshade Art, Maria Vasquez, Astral Fox Art, Middle Z, Milky Bat, Lilia Lur, The Expressive Poker Face, Morrissey Axolotl, Tsubaki, Liliana Hammondtree, Michael Lavalley, Cutie Pie, Rainwater Pearls, Ice Cream Pal, Cola, Your Boy ST, JJ Jade, and of course, La Blah Blah Blah.